We're going to move straight on to our next speaker, who I will introduce in a minute, but just because something fully brought up is important to our public program, I'd like to say that in the next set of events, which happen between the 8th and the 10th of May, we will be continuing to develop or highlight a conversation around what we're calling public capital, and we will be working with a number of anti-capitalist Islamic activists who will be talking about the relationship between anti-capitalist thought and Islamic thought. So watch this space. Look on the website at the beginning of May, and there'll be lots of information about that there. Okay, so now it's a great pleasure to introduce Dan Hind. Dan, are you ready? Ready as you'll ever be. Dan Hind is a UK-based ex-publisher, writer, journalist, columnist for Al Jazeera, in which he says that he has absolute freedom to write what he wants, which is very interesting when you think about how we normally imagine the journalistic world of publication and newspaper publication to be regulated. Dan wrote a few years ago. Dan, when was The Return of the Public published? 2010. So Dan wrote a book called The Return of the Public in 2000. It was published in 2010, which looks at the way in which the media outlets have both been completely privatized and maybe always privatized, but actually makes a very strong demand for the media as a new form of democratic production, and talks a great deal about that. And it's on that basis that we asked him to talk today in our program on the idea of public address. So Dan, the floor is yours for half an hour, and then we'll have more time for questions, and of course we hope to carry on picking up questions throughout the day. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Can everyone hear me? Is that kind of the right level? I came here with a prepared speech where I was going to run through some of the themes in my earlier work and the way in which I'm thinking about this relationship between the media, publicity, the public, and democracy. And as with Darren and Pedro, kind of arriving in Istanbul, one becomes immediately aware that one is in a different kind of space. And I'm conscious that a lot of what I'm talking about is really coming out of an Anglo-American or North Atlantic tradition of thinking about communications and democracy. So I'm acutely conscious that I'm talking in a different national context. I'm talking in a different set of particular circumstances. But as Darren was saying, much of what's happening in Istanbul has recognizable parallels with American and British experience. The notion of the global city is in a way an extension, an expansion of a sort of late modern American version of development, which is very much centered around the city, and it's very much centered around land speculation as a form of capital accumulation. If you think of capitalism as a predatory system, finance is efflorescing, finance is becoming the dominant mode for thinking about the economy because it's the most brilliant predator. Production is being subordinated to finance, even consumption and kind of traditional ways of thinking about capital accumulation are being displaced by almost purely speculative modes. And as I say, this is a trend that you can trace back to the 1950s and to the work of a sociologist called C. Wright Mills, who I'll talk a bit about in what follows. Listening to Ahmet Guntan's poem, I was listening to it on headphones and could only pick up certain things, but there was a line in it which I've kind of held on to, as it were, as a life raft. And there's a line where he says, "I'm breaking up with the news." And that is, it seems to me, but my reason for my relief is, thank God, we're actually on the same page. We are at a moment where we are breaking up with the news. And what I want to talk a bit about is how we got as it were, in bed with the news, how we developed our relationship with the news in the traditional way of thinking about the news, in the kind of broadcast mode. I want to talk a bit about what that implied for our politics. And I want to talk a bit about where we are now, how our relationship with the news, our relationship with fact, relationship with emotion, that we grew up with in a broadcast context, is being changed and being contested in this digital context. So hopefully what I talk about will come back to some of the ideas developed in the previous speech. The title of the talk is Public Alchemy, and as you know, the notion of alchemy is you take a base material and you turn it into gold. You take lead and you turn it into gold. My work is looking at the relationship between masses and publics. What does it take to turn a mass into a public? What do we mean by a mass? Do we mean an audience? So what does it take to turn an audience into an aspect of, as it were, co-production? The model of alchemy we'll return to, but what I'm going to try and show you, I think, is that rather than thinking in terms of a transformation of the matter itself, what we are looking for is a rearrangement of the particles. So rather than the classic alchemical mode of changing lead into gold, we take graphite, a particular arrangement of carbon, and we turn it into diamonds. And it's not about changing us. It's not about changing our substance. It's to do with changing the relationships with which we are embedded with others. So let me talk a bit about what I think of as well, the broadcast paradigm of communications. And this is the kind of ex-modern way of thinking about communications. And it's so familiar that it will actually, the notion that it has a history, I think, is somewhat sort of estranging. It's kind of peculiar to think of it having historical origins. In the 1920s in the United States, you have an incredibly intense debate between two models of communication. Broadly speaking, you have in one corner Walter Lippmann, who is the wunderkind of American reaction. He's described by Teddy Roosevelt as the brightest young man he'd ever met. And he went on to have a stellar career as one of the most sophisticated conservatives of all time. The reason why he's such a sophisticated conservative is that he's usually described as a liberal. In the other corner is an incredibly prodigious and often extremely verbose and difficult to grasp theorist of democracy called John Dewey. And their debate really, I see as the sort of genesis of, or the outcome of the debate is the genesis really of the broadcast model. In two books in the 1920s, Public Opinion and The Phantom Public, Walter Lippmann argues powerfully for the idea that America's communication system needs to be reorganized. I'm conscious I don't want to overrun, and I do tend to overrun, so just check the time. America's information systems need to be reorganized, they need to be modernized. He looks at the kind of Babel of the American press, and he says what America needs is a body very much like the British Foreign Service, a group of experts who can boil down all the stereotypes and cliches with which people think and extract the factual material on which policies can be made and then crucially sold to the public. He is an embodiment of the idea that the public is incapable of judgment. It doesn't understand the issues at hand. And he has great fun pointing out how ridiculous it is to imagine that a single citizen could deal with all the complexities of government. So his notion of communications is that you have a directorate who can decide what the facts of the matter are, what the relevant facts are, and can then sell it to an essentially passive audience. Now, the fact that the model he has for this directorate of experts is the British Foreign Service, who he meets during his war work in World War I think is highly significant, because Lippmann grows up in a late republic. He grows up in a republic which is reaching the limits of self-government as it understands itself. And his solution is to reorganize America on imperial lines. Lippmann's book prompts John Dewey to write a response, which is called The Public and Its Problems. And in it, Dewey tries to formulate a counter-argument. He recognizes the problem that, that Lippmann identifies, which is that what Lippmann calls spontaneous democracy can't really function beyond the scale of a small market town, essentially. You think of classical Istanbul, you think of Byzantium, you think of the city-state. In those conditions, you can have unmediated democracy. And similarly, in revolutionary America, these self-governing townships could function without highly mediated forms of information. As you start to increase the scale, particularly as America becomes a continental power, the notion that wandering about and chatting to people will give you the information you need to exercise your rights or your duties as a citizen becomes increasingly unreal. And Dewey doesn't want to give up on the idea of democratic self-government. He's in a way one of the last great theorists of American republicanism. And he puts his faith in the idea of face-to-face communication. He puts his faith in the idea, essentially, of the public meeting. And he says that democracy will have to have a local component. And he says the local community is the medium in which a vast but dormant intelligence can be made articulate and intelligible. And one of the things I think I want to emphasize about Dewey's work is that he understands the meeting as a medium. One of the things that broadcast has done over the last 50 years is it's stripped away the idea that people meeting in space, or indeed in hyperspace, are themselves constituting a medium. It is a form of exchange to meet and to discuss matters face to face. And this is part, I think, of how one resolves this tension that was talked about earlier between fact and sentiment. How do we escape from the tyranny of sentiment when these brilliant cinematographers are presenting us with these incredibly seductive images? Part of how we do that, it seems, is by meeting and encountering one another as bodies in space. Because the true glamour, it seems to me, is in public engagement. And that's certainly my experience, my limited experience of Occupy, was that there was a profoundly disenchanting effect when one was dealing with people as public agents, as public actors, no longer mediated through the spectacle. So you have this tension between Dewey's notion of communication as being a conversation between equals, where conversation is an attempt, obviously, to transform others, but in which one is at risk, that one can oneself be transformed through the exchange. One is in play, if you like. And Lippmann's notion that there is an unchanging truth that can be grasped by experts, responsible experts, who look a lot like British diplomats. And by the way, if you've ever met a British diplomat, you can realize the full horror of what Lippmann is proposing. There is an unchanging truth which will be delivered by an unchanging body of experts, what Bakunin called in another context, aristocrats of intelligence, who will decide what you should and shouldn't know. Now, writing 30 years after that, C. Wright Mills, the great theorist of elite power in the United States, whose sociology of the American city is developed further by people like William Domhoff, who, if you're interested in what's going on in Istanbul, I recommend you look at Domhoff's work on American urban development, because it is, I think, as I said earlier, highly relevant. But Mills is interested in this distinction, or this division between the public and the mass, and he talks about it in ways that map very closely onto the Lippmann-Dewey debate of the 1920s. And working along Deweyan lines, Mills argues that the archetype of public communication is the conversation between equals. And he writes, in a public society, virtually as many people express opinions as receive them. And communications are so organized that there is a chance immediately and effectively to answer any opinion expressed in public. Not only that, but citizens can translate their opinion into legislation, so they can have an effect on policy on the basis of what they decide collectively. And crucially, they say, in a public society, citizens can act secure in the knowledge that, quote, no agent of formal authority moves among the autonomous public. So in a public society as conceived by Mills, you do not have the manipulation of the public sphere by agents of the state or agents of private interests who are acting, as it were, duplicitously. The archetype of mass communication, on the other hand, is the broadcast, where you have one unanswerable, essentially unanswerable voice which speaks to millions of passive listeners. There's no scope for, or very little scope for, listeners to speak back. And he goes on to say that in a properly mass society, even private dissent is outlawed or is subject to penalties. He goes on to say, the public is terrified into uniformity by the infiltration of informers and the universalization of suspicion. And I think it's quite important, I think, to think a bit about the ways in which covert action can be used to manipulate and subvert the public sphere. Coming, as I say, from a North Atlantic context, this is not a particularly prominent feature of our public debate about the media. There's a great deal of talk about commercial power, but much less emphasis these days is put on the role of the state, and it's something I want to come back to a bit later. So for Mills, the public and the mass society are at the ends of a spectrum, and it's always a good idea, I think, for us to think a little bit about what extent do we live in a public culture, what extent do we live in a mass culture. In Britain, there's a certain sense of self-congratulation that we have these public spaces where we can exchange views freely. It's not entirely true. There are penalties that attach to certain kinds of public candor. There are certain kinds of restraints on civil society. And because of the dominance of broadcast as a model until very recently, it's been relatively easy to marginalize points of view that are seriously challenging or aggressive towards the established model of political and crucially communication infrastructure. I'm going to skip on a bit. As I say, I tend to overdo things. I mean, as a sidebar, I think it's clear that broadcast wins in the United States, both with radio and with television. America becomes a broadcast society, and it remains a broadcast society until quite recently. And a lot of what we think about when we think about the media is a kind of inheritance from that period. Where I agree with Darren and Pedro is that we are in the midst of a genuinely transformative moment in the organization of the media. Digital technologies are changing the ways in which politics and the media interrelate. Politics and media and commerce interrelate. And I think the thing I would emphasize is that this is a moment of conflict, because the same people and the same interests who went for Lippmann as a solution to the problem of mass government, right? How do you control a large nation? You do it through broadcast, you do it through the assembly of expertise, and you do it through an essentially manipulative model of communications, right? Where you have an aristocracy of intelligence, but the moment you have an aristocracy, you have a mass. There is an object on which your aristocracy of intelligence acts, right? That's the solution of broadcast. How do you govern the potential anarchy of the United States, a continental nation state? You do it through broadcast, okay? The networks are some of the very few national institutions, genuinely national institutions in the United States. And there's a very good reason for that, because broadcast is how the nation is knitted together and made compliant with certain sorts of overriding notions about what can and cannot be discussed. Just to put the matter bluntly, often Americans will talk about their media system as being a private media system. It's a system that's based on private enterprise. In about 1982, the National Security Council published circulated a memorandum, which was later declassified, in which they described the situation thus. They said the nation's domestic and international telecommunications resources, including commercial, private, and government-owned, are essential elements in support of US national security policy and strategy. Okay? So the broadcast infrastructure is a wholly owned franchise of the American state. And this is something that is often missed when Americans talk a lot about freedom of speech and the First Amendment and so on. Broadcast is a zone in which government control is overwhelming. As I say, I think we are now at a crucial moment of conflict, because broadcast is being called into question. Moments like Occupy and the Arab Spring are only really possible because of these social media, and we can criticize them, and I would criticize them very strongly in lots of ways. But nevertheless, this technology is in some ways enabling. There is some way in which people are able to share information without recourse to centralized broadcast infrastructures. I remember listening to a talk by some of the activists involved in the Tahrir Square uprising, and they said, you know, this notion that it was a Facebook revolution is kind of grossly overstated. But where new technology played an extremely important part was in Bluetooth technology. People were able to share videos, particularly of police atrocities, without recourse to the state media, which was obviously heavily censored. So there was a growing sense of outrage and a sense of disgrace, really, about the way in which their country was being governed, that was being shared and was building without being reliant on a professional and therefore vulnerable media establishment. On the other hand, we are at a situation where, certainly in the United States and in Britain, a very small number of companies are gaining a greater and greater degree of control over what people tend to see on the internet. Most page views are being captured by, I think, 5 big corporations: Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft. They, in one way or another, will take up about 70% of all eyeball time online. They are in communication with the state about how to manage this new dispensation. Lippmann has not gone away. There are people in the State Department, there are people in the British Civil Service and in all countries which are trying to figure out how to make interactive media governable. They're trying to tame interaction. And what they want is a return to the broadcast model, but with a little bit more pointing and clicking. Mae West once said, in Hollywood, sincerity is the most important thing. And if you can fake that, you've got it made. Right? Interactivity is the most important thing. And if you can fake that, you've got it made. Right? So one of the things I think we're going to see is areas of licensed dissent. So one of the things that they're conscious of, they can't shut down, they can't, as it were, switch off the radio transmitter. There will be opportunities for people to challenge their messages. And the name of the game really will be to minimize the damage, cauterize the damage. So they'll want to create a situation where if you are in your 20s and you're rebellious, before you get your job in an advertising agency or before you get clinically depressed, you'll have an opportunity to meet other dissidents and you'll have a sense that things are changing. Right? There's a change afoot. This is great. Unfortunately, your parents have no idea what you're talking about. Right? Your cousins in another town know no clue what you're talking about. So you're alienated through dissent. So I don't want to sound paranoid, but it would be a mistake to think that the guys who brought you broadcast aren't clever and aren't thinking very carefully. And the final thing I'd say on this is that there is a recognizable circulation of personnel between big corporations like Google and Twitter and the American State Department and the daddy of all broadcast institutions, the BBC. This is an important thing to bear in mind. They are going where the action is. And remember, the fun and games is to be had as an aristocrat. Right? They're not, I would argue, sincere democrats of information. So what's the alternative? What are we fighting for in this shift from a broadcast paradigm to an interactive paradigm, whatever you want to call it, this kind of modern convergent digital system? What would it mean to have public media in the way that Mills describes it, where we speak as equal participants in a conversation, where we are, as it were, real to one another? We have some public presence. I don't know whether you have radio phone-ins, I'm sure you do in Turkey. There is in broadcast this pretense at being able to answer back to the media. But if you're honest, or if I'm honest, when I hear someone calling up a radio or a television program, my overwhelming fear is that they're going to say something inappropriate. Right? I'm on the side of the presenter who's kind of likable and he's a professional of speech. So the cards are held by the professionals. So how can we use this technology in a way that strips away this fear we have of one another as public agents, and allows us to influence each other on the basis, yes, of our emotional presence in one another's experience, but also on the basis maybe of the facts every now and again. I am coming, I suppose, from a sort of fairly unreconstructed Enlightenment notion that a public sphere has to have within it space for people to communicate, as Kant says, as scholars before a reading public. But I'm acutely aware that that's not enough, that posting a factual critique on the internet, making the facts available, will not make us free. There's much more to it than that, obviously. Now, I talk a lot more in The Return of the Public about what I think a public media system needs, what it would mean to have a media system that supports a public society. So I'll talk about it very, very briefly here. I mean, the first thing to say, contra a lot of what we hear from the spectacle, the state is a player in this. The state is a very important coordinating player in this. And as I said earlier, when the National Security Administration says, you know, your medias are us, or whatever the meme is, you know, they own this, this telecommunications space. It's important to bear that in mind, because any suggestion that we collectively organize our communications will be reacted against by a kind of libertarian move. And it's a libertarian move, by the way, which is being lavishly funded, I think, by the technology companies. Though they're sharing personnel with the State Department, they want to pretend that what they're doing is an emergent fact of the technology. So the state is a player. And if we want to have a public media system, we have to accept the role of a collective institution. Essentially, we need the state to be involved, but as a public player. And what I propose in The Return of the Public is you have, I mean, I'm talking in a British context, so I talk a lot about the BBC, but what I propose there is that every single individual as a citizen has some means, some opportunity to influence the editorial agenda of the dominant media with which they have to operate. What that means is that everyone has a potential power to say, I'm interested in this subject, I'd like to know more about it. Or to say, I don't think we know enough collectively about this subject, and I think we should learn more about it. It's an opportunity for people who are motivated to enter the public sphere in a way that is truly public. That's to say, the increasingly digital field of widely known descriptions ceases to be the exclusive preserve of employees and owners, and it becomes something that individual citizens can combine with other citizens in order to influence and shape. The public sphere becomes a contested zone, a zone in which you cannot rule things out a priori. You can't say, as a professional, I've decided that's an inappropriate line of investigation. You allow the public, you give the public pay them the compliment of thinking they will figure out, on the basis of a free exchange, what is relevant information to them and what they need to know more about. And the reason I developed this idea, which causes a great deal of upset amongst liberals, memorably I was at a media reform meeting in London, and I talked a bit about this idea, which is called public commissioning. So the idea that rather than being citizen journalists, which is I think part of the digital flim-flam, frankly, we become citizen editors. So we don't give up on the idea of professional journalism, we don't give up on the idea of expertise or a division of labor, but we insist that the commissioning process is something in which we are involved, because if we don't do that, we won't be able to properly illuminate the operations of capital, we won't be able to properly illuminate the operations of private corporations, crucially, we won't be able to illuminate the operations of the media. So when I talk a bit about the idea that everybody, like everybody, being able to engage through the allocation of funds, through, as it were, the kind of voting funds towards particular media projects. When I gave this summary to a group of media reformers, one of them reacted with, I can only describe as furious hostility. And they said, they'll just want stories about Rihanna, right? So, now what's interesting about that, there's lots of things that's interesting about that. One of the things that's interesting about that is that if you want stories about Rihanna, it's not difficult to find them, right? So the notion that you're the other, you know, the member of the mass, will be given this power to shape the public sphere and go, you know what we need more of? We need more pictures of Rihanna. That's what we need, because every time I go to the supermarket, I only get like 100 magazines with her on the front. So I want more. But there's also this terror, I think, of the other. The idea that status depends on not being a member of the mass. Status is about being on the inside. Status is about being one of Lippmann's experts. And the problem, I think, that a lot of people have with this notion of kind of widespread participation in the creation of the public sphere is that it cuts against the notion that I certainly have sometimes, that I know better, right? Things would be much better if I was in charge, if I had control, right? And we all kind of think that, and there's this kind of this massive wall of imagery telling us that we're sovereign and that we can just express ourselves, and we can be all we want to be and so forth. The creation of a democratic public sphere requires that we all recognize our limitations, and we recognize that if it's left to us and our prejudices, certain things will go unsaid. We can all be picked off. And the only thing you cannot co-opt and bribe is everyone. Because if everyone's being bribed, then what we have is not bribery, it's something else. Okay? So I think I'm going to end there. But in summary, as I say, the temptation is to think that we need to be a different kind of thing. We need to change our subjectivity in some radical way. There's a long tradition, and it's a troublesome tradition of a new kind of human being that will be created through revolutionary practice. Praxis is the word, isn't it? It's not about us as individuals. It's not about us trying harder and being better or being all we can be. It's about the kinds of systems we have to communicate with others. Because if we're not careful, we will see the broadcast regime, the broadcast system, being reconstituted on essentially the same lines, but using a new technology. But we do have an opportunity to intervene in this. We have an opportunity to constitute ourselves as publics. And in large part, that's made possible by these new technologies. These technologies are massively ambiguous, but they do offer us an opportunity to break out of the algorithm. And that's where I think I would end this, is that capitalism is all-enveloping, but it lives somewhere. It lives in institutional realities, and it is subject to challenge. And if we want to challenge it, then democratizing the public sphere is the first and necessary step. Until we can talk about what we know, and until we know what other people know, until we talk about our preferences, until we know about what other people's preferences are, without the mediation of these largely corporate but also state institutions, further change is going to be impossible. So, as was said earlier, we face an environmental catastrophe. At a factual level, this is becoming increasingly widely accepted. It is not entering the world of policy, and it will not do so until we have some effective means to say to one another, are you concerned about this? Good, because I got the impression that you just didn't care, because that's what the adverts were telling me. So democratizing the public sphere is where I think it starts. Thank you.